Welcome to Corwin's Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast with hosts Peter DeWitt and Michael Nelson. This podcast is from education leaders for education leaders. Every week, Peter, Mike, and our guests get together to share ideas, put research into practice, and ensure that every student is learning not by chance, but by design.
Michael Nelson.
We're back again here. Are you excited?
Yes, I am, because we have Zaretta Hammond. And, to me, Zaretta is just always amazing to talk to. She's somebody I interviewed a few years ago for Education Week. I followed her work. I've known her for a number of years. So I think our audience today is going to be in for some really important information, really important research for when it comes to learning. And this is not just for teachers to do, it's for school leaders to do as well. But you suggest that they should actually have a piece of paper with them.
I did. I found myself as I just feel like you could either rewind it and listen to it again, or needed a piece of paper, because I was making this mind map of information as she was speaking.
So for those of you that don't know, Zaretta is a former high school and community college expository writing instructor. She's also served as an adjunct professor at St. Mary's College School in California, where she taught the foundations of adolescent literacy. As a consultant, she has advised and provided professional development to school districts and nonprofit organizations across the country around the issues of equity, literacy, and culturally responsive teaching for the past well over 25 years. So I am excited for people to hear this, just because I feel like Zaretta is just deeply knowledgeable, and she's working on a new book that'll come out in late winter of 2025. And she just brings so much when she's talking about leveling up learning, but also just the common language around how to be responsive.
She was quite remarkable, yet she kept the students at the center, and you're going to hear that over and over again, Peter.
Well, enjoy the interview, and we will see you on the other side. Zaretta Hammond.
Zaretta.
Say goodbye to slow-paced teaching methods and join an innovative new framework. With Teacher Clarity Professional Learning Workshops, teachers can learn how to double the speed of learning with clear goals and measurable outcomes. Get started today at corwin.com.
Zaretta Hammond, welcome to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Oh my gosh, it is so good to see you. It's been a few years, but thank you for being here. You have had a huge influence on me. I know you may or may not remember this, but you were the second guest I ever had on a seat at the table.
Oh, wow.
And I don't even remember what question I asked, but I remember you just said, let's unpack what you just said. And I went, oh no. And I emailed you a few months later and said that was the best thing that could have happened to me, because I was a guy that always thought that I got it, inclusivity and everything else. And I learned a lot about implicit biases and questions, and it made me so much better at talking about topics that people find to be difficult. And as a moderator for whether it's a podcast or a seat at the table for Ed Week, you made me better in that moment. And I just wanted to make sure I thanked you again for that.
And I deeply appreciate that, because I do believe that is really my mission, not necessarily to be out front and be the person who is changing everything. It's the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And my job is to support them to be the best they can be, to hold space for those that they are trying to, shepherd through transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's no small effort. And being able to have shared language, to have the emotional resilience and stamina when conflict arises, because that's just part of what we do, and that it's not a bad thing. So I deeply appreciate that reflection.
Zaretta, I have equally the admiration for you, and have seen you speak in large audiences in many different places and times and dates and have read your work and articles and am just, you are a name. If I see, I'm going to gravitate to that piece of writing or to that video or to that conference. And my colleagues feel the same. And so as I was preparing, and this season I have the opportunity to co-host Leaders Coaching Leaders with Peter. As I was sharing that this day was coming up, um, first of all, often my colleagues their mouth would drop and say, "No way, you're going to be just on a small little Zoom screen with Zaretta Hammond." And I said, "Yes, but here's what I know. Uh, I know through the language that you use and the way in which you write, you're a deeply humble person who really is committed to making education a better place." Having said that, our audience, I know, want to know a few key things that are so vitally important. Um, who do you listen to? What's a book that you currently are reading? And what's a boring fact about you? So I'm gonna throw those three quick things out because our audience on Leaders Coaching Leaders desperately need to know a book, somebody you're listening to, and a boring fact about Zaretta Hammond.
Yeah, let's just start with the books. My mother was a library technician when I was growing up. That was part of California Welfare to Work program. Like, in order to get these benefits, you have to go to work and we're going to place you somewhere. So that was my after school playground, the library. So I've never met a book I don't like. And so uh, I do try and stay atop of what the research is saying, particularly around the science of learning, the science of reading right now. But I also read a little bit outside of education, meaning
Mm,
there are a lot of good education authors, books being put out, but I also know that a lot of what we should be reading as educators is just one or two steps outside of that. So I have a tendency to read what's going on in social neuroscience.
mm.
How are, there's one right now, the extended, what is it? It's not in front of me. So it's extended body, embodied learning. So this idea that cognition is not just in the head, but our body remembers. So
Mm.
how, when we start to think about leveling up learning, should we make the connection to what that's saying? I think a lot of the authors that I'm reading, because I'm writing my next book, come out of Project Zero.
Mhm.
And I don't think they get lifted up as much. David Perkins, he talks about this idea of the whole game of learning and helping students learn the whole game. Then there is uh, Guy,
Clarkson. Clarkson.
yes.
Yeah,
Why are we all not reading him? I
I
don't,
know. He's
it's like,
fantastic.
my goodness, because what they do, and these books are kind of all in that same, category of really pulling back the curtain on the learning process. I
Mhm,
feel like one of the things that happens too often, we get focused on the strategy
mhm,
and therefore pour all our energy into implementation fidelity of the strategy, and we kind of forget about the student.
mhm.
We do this thing to the student, so we want to get the moves right and assume that it's just magical, and because we did all the moves right to the strategy, it's going to have a result on the student. And we forget that learning is dynamic, and these authors remind us of the science of
Mhm.
learning and in practical terms. This is not just here's theoretical, right? We can go back to the classic, make learning stick. That is, I keep going back to that book, and it's like, ooh, you know we should kind of put this up and really help people understand it. And so these are a few things that I read and continue to go back to, because I do want to help educators really understand what it means to put the student back in the center. So, versus strategies. Yes, you do want strategies, but they're tools. You're actually teaching a person and that person is a variable. And to me, this is the responsive of culturally responsive teaching. So we have a tendency to focus on the culture part, anti-racism and inclusion and all those things, but we forget about the responsive. What does it mean to be a good instructional decision maker and therefore be responsive when the student's stuck? That's DeForest's third question. What will we do when the student doesn't learn it? So
Right.
long answer for what books, capture my attention. And then, I'm trying to get back to a little more fiction in my life. So slowly but surely. What was the second question?
Just who do you admire? Who do you listen to? Who
Who
does
do
Zaretta Hammond listen to?
in terms of podcast?
Yeah.
I will have to out myself. I do not listen to education podcasts.
There's
Perfect.
nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely.
I do listen to one, and that is Tim Logan. He is in the UK, and it's called The Future of Learning, and he's got the best guests on there. And they really, again, there's Norma Bateson, and she talks about warm data and this whole way of humanizing. It's just like, oh, and his episodes drop every Sunday. So it's my little brain candy on Sunday mornings to listen to his podcast. Other than that, the ones that try to be practical, I think are oversimplifying. And again, strategy stripping is what I call it. Like, let's just find the cool strategies and we forget about what do you do? The student is confused. You've tried the thing. Now what will you
Right.
do? So I limit, that. I do listen to, other things that are kind of motivational and insightful about development, like Stoicism. Ryan Holiday, who's written a lot of books,
Mhm.
he is like, a big proponent of Stoicism and the whole philosophy of how do we better ourselves. And I think it's very much related to the idea of how do we grow ourselves. So, in terms of what I'm writing about right now, how do we grow our own learning power? How do we start to have a sense that we don't have to live in a pedagogy of compliance, right? And yeah, so that's kind of what feeds me right now. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I want to get to a couple of the things that you said. So I'm glad Mike asked those questions because then it just led into about 10 questions that I want to ask you. But I'll just start with one. So you were mentioning earlier about responsiveness, and I know that you're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of
Yeah.
culturally responsive teaching and the
Wow.
brain. But what does responsiveness mean? Because we're always trying to get that shared understanding. We have a common language, but not a common understanding. And so when you're talking about, you're absolutely right. Like the strategy is the thing, but I want to learn more about the responsiveness. What does that mean?
Yeah, and what it means is educator who so much to say is running through my brain. Back in the day, when I was cutting my teeth as a baby teacher, I was in California, and the Carnegie Foundation brought teachers together. Lee Shulman, and a whole other host of teacher educators that were on the cutting edge, and that what they talked about is pedagogical content knowledge and instructional decision making.
Mhm.
And I think one of the most unfortunate parts of culturally responsive teaching that has happened is people have relegated to the relational realm, and they've not really seen the fullness of it. And what I learned during that era of Lee Shulman and his colleagues talking about um, the idea of instructional decision making was very much what I understood in the research of culturally responsive, that responsive. How will you respond to students when they are confused, which is before, helping us understand what do we want students to know? How will we know when they know it? And what will we do when they don't know it? And usually when we're talking in the instructional core, that happens when a student's confused, or you see they're making the same mistake, or they seem to not understand and they're waiting for the teacher to actually jump in there and over scaffold. So this is a response, maladaptive response to student confusion as the teacher's over scaffolding. So I really want people to understand that culturally responsive teaching is full body. That's why my Ready for Rigor framework really does have, yes, awareness and learning partnerships, relational, and having a equity lens on society and anti-racist view of the world, making sure that those things don't go unchecked. But that's just the first part. Then there's improving information processing prowess. And this really is a missed opportunity because that is the way that the system was set up by those that wanted to segregate and stratify and, under educate certain groups. And the technique was allowed to go unchecked. And that technique is simply don't give students, challenging opportunities. Don't engage them in the tools to learn how to do productive struggle, how to, think deeply. So even now that we have things like deeper learning and UDL, the Universal Design of Learning and project-based learning, we still have neglected the information processing skill set. So you can give students all these wonderfully, enriching experiences, but if they don't have the internal apparatus developed, then it's not going to result in students making meaning, turning inert information into usable knowledge, right? And this to me is what I see when I sit in classrooms a lot. Teachers doing most of the cognitive work,
Mhm.
um, they miss the responsive part, and they think that only means making content relevant. There's a difference between making content relevant, so the student schema recognizes it, and being responsive. How will I help you connect the new to the known? Because that's what the first principle of the science of learning tells us. In order to actually make meaning, you have to activate your schema, take in new information and connect it, integrate it with your existing funds of knowledge. That's what information processing is. And if you look at cognitive neuroscience, it's, pretty spelled out process. But unfortunately, we don't require educators in their teacher education programs to understand a lot about that. And then in order to make it turnkey, which works against us, we oversimplify it. And teachers are still doing things to students versus coaching students to be what I call both metacognitive and metastrategic, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I mean about it, right? That you can actually piece it apart, take it apart, and go deeper into the science of learning, but a lot of people are just using it in a very superficial way, culturally responsive teaching. And I'm being culturally responsive because I've got more brown faces in books, or
Mm,
because
right.
we have morning meetings and we do restorative circles. I mean, it's just all this kind of checkbox language
Mm.
um, that doesn't actually improve the information processing skills of the students. And, Robert Marzano in 2004, in building background knowledge, this was one of the things he said. If you don't build information processing skills, doesn't matter what experiences you give to students, you're going to just continue to grow your own achievement gaps.
And the whole time when you were talking and answering, I kept thinking about metacognition, that whole time, that the whole idea of thinking about your own thinking and all of that. I mean, I'm a guy that, I was retained in elementary school, like graduated fourth from last from high school, fourth from last from high school in my graduating class. And um, when I learned more about metacognition and how whether it's time management or study skills or whatever it is, I mean, that was when my life changed
Yeah.
and my grades went up and everything else. So that to me is just, everybody needs to know that, because I felt like I left high school not having that skill.
That's exactly it.
And
And this is my upcoming book is really about how do we grow those skills. But I
yeah,
will say that metacognition is tier one,
yeah,
the prep work, right?
yep,
Because again, thinking about your thinking, but if my thinking is low level,
yes,
guess what I'm thinking about?
yeah, that's true. Yeah,
Metacognition doesn't change
Yeah.
your ability to process information. It just
Yeah.
makes you aware of what you need to change.
Mhm.
The next step is what Ron Rickard out of Project Zero,
Mhm.
famous for making thinking visible,
Yep.
he talks about metastrategic. And that is, can you engage the student in a kind of instructional conversation to be aware of their ability to consciously move things around,
Mhm.
to change their learning moves, to pay attention to the information that their errors give them and study that as data, not as some I'm stupid or I can't get it. So, the reframing of what you need, and you need those two together. I can't just
Mhm.
help you be meta-strategic and you're not even aware of
Right.
your own thinking. Then that's where I see a lot of teachers doing the work, like do this next and do that next. And the student can go through the motions, but without the awareness, it doesn't get internalized. And it's more than study skills. It is literally processing information so that you can go from, I don't really understand what that's about, to, oh, I see how that's connected.
Mhm.
Right. And so being able to, and that's just not a skill set. I see that we're giving a lot of younger teachers who are going through, really well developed residency programs or alternative pathways, right? And so there's some way that we have to continue to support them. And this is that idea of leading with intention, right? That
Mhm.
we have to be intentional to say, we know they may not get it there. And the response isn't to shake our fist at teacher education programs. It's to say, we recognize this. You can only do so much in the amount of time, and we grow as teachers. So in the first 3 years, this should be what we are able to help in terms of developing these skills. For teachers who have been in the classroom, how do we use professional learning community to help them develop these capacities so when they go in back in the classroom with the students, they can actually be able to coach the student to this higher level of meta-strategic development, which in turn will improve information processing, which will grow their learning power, right? It's not quick and easy. And I
No.
think sometimes a lot of people are just looking for give me the quick version, give me the
Yes.
microwave version. Anybody who says that, despite what's coming out of their mouth, is not committed to equity. So
Yeah.
again, like the old saying says, don't listen to what people say, watch what they do,
Mhm.
believe them. And if they're doing that, looking for turnkeys, having teachers over scaffold to get into high quality grade level materials, the students should be able to access those because you've actually taught them the skills of learning,
Mhm.
not because teachers are kind of breaking down and pre-chewing the content for the student. So yeah, it's a little more complicated algorithm, but I don't think it's beyond the capacity of any teacher to learn. I've
Right.
seen that actually happen.
I've sat here, it's like, if you were to look at my piece of paper that's right below, this is a podcast different than I think any other ones that I've been a part of, Zaretta, because I think it's one that we want our viewers. You might need a piece of paper beside you, but what's different about you, honestly, and it meant to be a huge compliment, is everything that you mention or cite is connected to one to another. And so I feel like I could see into your brain a bit of this is a the idea of learning and putting students at the center, like you said, is a strong mission vision in putting that puzzle together. So thank you for that. In the last little bit, you talked about your new book, and it looks like it's going to be out and available to all of us maybe in the first quarter of 2025. Teaching for Instructional Equity, I think, is somewhere in the name of it. And we would love to hear your thinking behind that,
Yeah.
and give the
Well,
enticing teaser to our audience.
that's what you've just been scribbling on your paper. That's all I think about. That's all I talk about is actually what culturally responsive teaching of the brain set up. But what I found, I made an assumption about what we were preparing teachers to do. Most
Mm.
teachers are being trained to cover their content and not necessarily to coach the student into learning how to learn. So the book is really is breaking down just all of those things you just scribbled on your paper in a way that a team could take it into their PLC
Mm.
and actually know what to do. It's a playbook, it's a workbook, it's a guidebook for instructional leaders. So what should be the policies and practices that I am putting in place to actually support these shifts at the classroom level? And again, it's not that it's without strategies, but the teacher is the strategy, that power to coach the student. And that means you're going to have to reorder time. That means you're going to have to actually uh, create a culture of errors in your classroom where students have language and skill and time to actually talk about what they got wrong and how that is giving them some information about what they might do differently. Now, these are all things I touched on in culturally responsive teaching, but it
Mhm.
was clear to me people couldn't take it to the fruition application because that was not what they were given the skills and the opportunity for. So I want to really see people leverage their professional learning communities to bring this work into that professional learning community, because that's where they're going to be doing transformative work, inquiry cycles for the better part of that academic year. And why not actually focus on how are we coaching students to level up their learning? So in essence, that's really what it is. Everything that I've been talking about for the last 10 years, I want to give educators, particularly instructional coaches and classroom teachers, teacher leaders, the the missing manual, if you will, around this idea of instructional decision making and coaching students to higher level of learning how to learn.
See, and I think we need to bring it up a level too. I don't think it's just the PLCs when I hear you talk, because one of the things that, Mike and I always focus on collective leader efficacy. So shared understanding, engaging in joint work, and evidence of impact. And when you were talking, uh, there are topics you're talking about, and there are things you're talking about that there are people in the school that don't know. You know this already because you said they weren't doing it necessarily with culturally responsive teaching. So when I look and say, yeah, I think it's great, the PLC should be able to do it. But as a former school building leader, I want to know too. Because if I'm coming in to do observations, if I'm doing walkthroughs, if I'm
Right.
just having a conversation with you in general and want to be able to support you, I need to know this information too. And it also made me think of Vivian Robinson's work around promoting, participating in teacher learning and development. To me, anytime I've talked to you and hear you today, to me, what's exciting is I don't need to know it all right now. I want to learn it with my teachers at the same time. And I think there's a fear there because this is a leaders coaching leaders podcast. And, there are going to be a lot of leaders listening. My thinking is sometimes the go-to is going to be, yeah, teachers need to know how to do this, but they need to know it too. And
Yes.
and Mike and I were both, principals. Mike was a superintendent. To me, it speaks to what we want out of leadership, which is I need to be sitting at the table in my instructional leadership team meeting and having these discussions too, learning it with my teachers and being okay to model to my teachers and say, I don't know it either. Like I want to learn it through our discussions and reading this book and putting some of these things into action. And I don't think there's not a question there, but I guess the
No,
question would be, how do school leaders let themselves off the hook to be prepared for errors as much as we want teachers to be able to?
right. And I think this is a great question or, point you're lifting up because a lot more of the folks that I end up talking to and coming together with are leaders and superintendents.
Yeah.
But and we have long conversations. Some just pop into my inbox and because they are feeling at a impasse.
Mm.
Change is necessary. They see it walking through their classrooms, but what it actually takes to shift people is really the challenge, right? So I call that change management for equity. So how do we engage them in not only thinking about the learning how to learn so that we're all on the same page, any kinds of walkthroughs are going to be aligned to that. So teachers don't feel like that, well, the principal wants me to do this, but you're saying to do that, right? So the principal as instructional leader has to create that alignment, right? How are we using time? What do we need to keep doing because we know it's moving things forward? What do we need to stop doing because it's having no impact or maybe a negative impact? This is
Mhm.
what Hattie tells us about effect sizes
Yep.
of particular practices. How in that instructional leader role can the principal, the AP teacher leaders actually kind of walk point for those PLCs. So I don't think they are learning um, all the same things, but there is the intersection. So when
Mhm.
I would gather teams to do some learning together, I always asked that it was a cross role team, that if teachers and coaches and leaders were not talking together, they would not have shared language. They would not be on the same page. So if we think about it kind of like you know, building a machine, there are different people or assembling a car. Different people are putting different parts on, but you have to know we're assembling a car. This
Mhm.
is what we're actually doing.
Yeah.
And the leader has a really particular role in buffering, right? We go back to what Dr. Richard Elmore
Mhm.
said about the instructional core, that it's not just what's going on in the classroom, but that buffering that happens, the culture that supports this, the policies that support it, how the instructional leader interfaces with the board so the boards doesn't start, with craziness, like we're gonna ban books and we're gonna do like they could, we love the school boards, but they are gonna come up with some stuff sometimes that the instructional leader really needs to be the universal translator. Here's why we do this. Here's the research behind it. Here's the buffering that we need to do. Here's historically how that's been part of reinforcing inequity by design. Help
Mhm.
people see what doesn't appear racialized actually has a racialized
Mhm.
outcome. And I think sometimes we don't give leaders the credit that they deserve for the important role they play in managing that change.
Mhm.
They also need to understand what are the learn to learn processes. What should I see when I walk into that classroom? So I can actually talk with my coaches and teachers are on the same page about what part of their practice they need to come together and think about. What other qualitative data do we need to be looking at? Not just the quantitative data of year in achievement test, standardized tests. There are a variety of other data and, some people have really leaned into street data. I think that's very valuable, but there are also other types of data around learning how to learn that are critically important. So being able to create the integrated process with all of those is so important. And pretty much that is going to be falling to the leader. So they need to be learning alongside their teachers, but not just like, oh, I've got to be, at zero. You need to be two steps ahead of them. So maybe you with your instructional leadership team should read the book first. You
Mhm.
should talk about aligning things before things are rolled out to the teachers. I see everybody let's just all do a book study. And like, there's going to be a Vulcan mind meld that comes, like we've read the book and now we're all going to be, able to help students improve their information processing. Information is not transformation. And I think it's the role of the leader, that intentionality around navigating the liminal spaces as we move from a particular stage of change to deeper types of change, and with it, the human side of change. It's really, really critical. It's no small job. I take my hat off to leaders, but it takes a village to give them the kind of support so that they can stay the course. There's so many forces saying just go back to status quo, but that's inequity by design talking.
Mhm. I think, and just, before Mike asks you a question, I just want to say too that when you have an instructional leadership team reading your book and understanding these things, it's also important for them, just like you've been connecting the dots for people, for that leadership team to actually look into classrooms to see how this work is being done already, as opposed to saying, I just read Zaretta Hammond's book and guess what we're going to get to do, because that makes you the enemy. And what they need to be able to do is really look and say, how are we doing some of this work already to
Yeah.
connect the dots for teachers so they're not scared to move in that direction too.
And Peter, here's what I'd also just say right before that. They need to just assess current reality. So
Yeah,
before you start doing anything, what are we currently doing?
right.
Because if you just add new things to mask some of the damaging things you do,
Mhm,
then you're going to run out of time. This is part
mhm,
of the conversation around teacher wellness and overwhelm,
mhm.
that they're just things we need to stop doing.
The
And
implementation, the
and
abandonment of low value practices.
absolutely. And at the same time, we're habitual creatures. We've been
Yeah,
doing it forever.
yeah.
So the degree to which that's where change management for equity is really important. What will you need to do? Because a book I really enjoy, it's an oldie but a goodie, 1994. You would think, oh, that the book has nothing to tell me. This is by Robert Evans, The Human Side of Change. This doesn't
Mhm,
change. And what he makes, the point he makes, which I think is so brilliant, he talks about anytime you have a change initiative, what's going to happen is some people are going to experience emotions, and those emotions can be lost. It
mhm,
can be confusion, not because they're confused about the change, but because when I stop doing something out of a routine, I'm just disoriented. And then there's an emotional response, and with that, certain behaviors. Then he says there's some people who are going to see this change as an affront to their competence.
mhm,
Oh, you want me to stop doing that because you don't think I'm good enough? It's like the leader now has to do all of that. So how is they preparing the instructional leadership team for this onset of emotions that's going to
mhm,
come because we do that? But when you can use the science, when you can use the data to say what is not getting us any impact, but it's going to give us back time. It's
mhm,
going to give us back calm and let people see what they actually get. That's why I said this, the leading with intentionality is the intentionality. This is why I love this, the Heath brothers, right? How to
mhm,
Change When
mhm,
Change is Hard. Switch is the title of their book. Subtitle, How to Change When Change is Hard. And that's what they talk about. Shape the path. This is where we're going, why we're going there. Direct the writer, kind of the rational mind. And then the elephant, the emotional part of that. If the leader does those three things based on kind of that framework, I think you're in a good position to help people really do the deep work of change, not just book study, strategy strip, and we're going to start doing these new things when this bad thing over here needs to stop.
mhm.
Incredible language and words. And what I think I appreciate is you never forget the student. So I believe if we were to do a word cloud on this interview right now, the word student would be the most predominant word that's been used. And I can tell you that's not common when I hear leaders talk, state and federal leaders. That's forgotten. And you go back to here, we're trying this strategy, and all of a sudden we're not using that word, the word student. And I have to say, and this may be a bit of a surprised kind of question to you, but I'm really curious. Um, I'm in the season of my life where I'm going to have grandchild number 4 coming in September. In the last 4 years, so 4 years, and we've increased our family by 4. And as I think through, it's like put the student back in the center of strategies. If I'm a parent, it's like put my child back in the center, not strategies. Do you have wisdom from the parent side? I'm just sitting here listening, thinking, oh, there's a companion book for young families. I think of my 2 sets of kids that have these 2 children, and there's there's learning from a parent perspective. So, any wisdom for families around this concept?
When I started working on equity, more equitable learning, and there was not a great receptivity to talking about equity, let alone using more culturally responsive practices. I always extended that to that my skill set to parents who were bumping up against these things.
Mhm,
So I would get, emails from parents who were in, the classrooms of my children in the school, like they're about to send my young child, classmate of my daughter's. I'm thinking back to that experience, to special education, young Black boy, not having any real problems. He just was slow to developing his, reading skills. But for them, that was caused to, put a lot variety of other labels. I mean, it got to the point that this was happening so often that I put together, here's a letter template. Fill it in with this. This is going to get you 6 weeks, just because of the laws. It's going to get you 6 weeks. This is what we'll do. I put a plan together and start to have a little kit in which it's like, here's the things you need to do. Because very much like back in the day, right? Jarvis Givens, for anybody's interested in reading his book, he's a assistant professor at Harvard. His book is Fugitive Pedagogy, and he talks about what Black teachers used to do back in the day. They'd get this low level curriculum designed to underdevelop cognition, and the teachers would look like they were going through that curriculum. And then when the white headmaster would walk out, they just throw it to the side and go back to doing the more rigorous and empowering kind of teaching. It wasn't even just the content, it was that they just got to do powerful learning. So what I tried to do is, even before I knew about that book or even the history of that, I would just prepare and so like, here's how you do that. Here's it, and you don't have to make it look like school. You have to hide the vegetables. And I would teach them how to hide the vegetables. How do you, make sure you know where your child's reading skills are? Don't just rely on the school. And it seems so counterintuitive if you are promoting schools. I am not anti-school, but if school's not getting it done, do not depend on that. Here's what we do. I train tutors in reading development. So a lot of my career back in the day, probably for 15 years, was parent support, lots of workshops in church basements where, parents gathered who, it wasn't just at that church. That's just where we could kind of gather because we were still not close to what we talked about in terms of community schools and 21st century schools. We talked about schools being that center of the community in which it had multiple uses and parents could gather. We never fully realized that. And so the reality is parents want their children to be successful. And too often what we're equating with success is you've got to be the fastest or you've got to get the best grades. Whereas if you're the most powerful learner, that's going to account for a lot. If you have intellectual curiosity, that's going to account for a lot. These are things that parents can cultivate. If you gamify and you and your child are playing games, I had to educate parents that rather than trying to teach your, 2-year-old to read, get mazes because that develops the beginning hand-eye coordination that lays the foundation for reading. If you puzzles, parents don't know the science of learning is so powerful. Puzzles are laying the foundation for students to be able to read and discern and discriminate the symbols that we then connect sounds to. So long before you have to get flashcards in kids, because there are things children don't want to do. They don't want to come home and have learning look like more school. Like, oh, we having more school now? No, I will not be having a serving of that. So hide those vegetables, make learning fun. And it should be. Learning is not the exclusive domain of schools. Humans are going to learn throughout their life, right? And even as you said, you're growing your family, you're getting more grandchildren, you're still growing. So we don't give up on that. I'm in that season of my life too. My children may or may not give me grandchildren. We stopped that conversation. But but the reality is, I've been in education 30 plus years. And so knowing that you really have to help parents understand it's a both and. Trust teachers, partner with teachers. Karen Mapp really talks about that work, but also know that we are the first teachers as parents, and we have that responsibility to protect our child's intellectual curiosity. Dr. Bettina Love calls it spirit murdering.
I love that. Yeah.
Right? That idea of a pedagogy of compliance where the student is told not to talk or when to move and, go check the classroom. If that's what it looks like, then you need to, really be active in the school to help them understand that's not the healthiest thing for intellectual curiosity. So I do think there's a realm of uh, dispositions as well as skills that parents can help with, but we don't need to replicate school at home.
Thank you.
That is a perfect way to end the podcast. Zaretta, I can't thank you enough. I'm always grateful for time to be able to talk with you. So thank you so much for being on our Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me and allowing me to talk about my new book. And I look forward to being back and talking about it some more down the road.
Oh, for sure. We are
Definitely.
looking forward to reading it and asking some deeper questions too. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Peter, Zaretta was pretty amazing, don't you think?
Yes, it's just really interesting to talk to her because she brings so much to the conversation, from the learning space to the equity space to the leadership involvement to the teachers. I felt like I wrote down a list of about 8 or 9 books that I need to buy or repurchase. But I really valued, and you pointed this out really well, I really valued how much she kept the conversation on the student. And you were the one who pointed that out during the interview and also before we started too.
She really did. Everything that she looped back, as our listeners who are finishing this podcast with us could, have a testimony that she did say that. And she oozes, terrible word, Peter, but she oozes learning.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the 10th year anniversary for cultural responsive teaching in the brain. And, her new book is coming out. She's just putting the final stages of it. And she talked about it's taking the book that she wrote 10 years ago. And after lots and lots of conversations that she thought the book itself could move into the application, realizing it didn't. And that, when we're teaching something, and if it's not fully there, we need to rethink how we approach that. And so this new book really is going to tie to the application side of the culturally responsive teaching. And when she said that, I thought, there's a readiness. There's a readiness that I think in education that what maybe wasn't quite there 10 years ago. I think when this book comes out, it's going to be an immediate bestseller.
I think and that's a really good point. You just made me think about the cautionary tale with all this. And this is, I guess, how we can end, is that the cautionary tale is you write a book and you put as much research and practice into it. It's not until after it comes out that you see how people are using the actual book that's been published. So I think the cautionary tale is for those of us that not only write books, but for those of us that actually are reading these books, whether it's education or non-education, are we really sure that we're putting these things into practice in the way that we should be? Or are we putting them into the practice that we're just thinking is the correct way, right? So it's like, that's why I love working with you, having a thought partner, being able to read the same thing and having you come at it from a different perspective makes me re-look at what I've read to make sure that I processed it correctly or understood it correctly. And I think that's part of maybe the underlying theme with Zaretta's interview as well. So as always, if you enjoy the podcast, please, give us any sort of feedback. But we think that a lot of the podcast interviews you're going to hear this season, just like in previous seasons, but our guests are really bringing it. And I think these are podcast interviews that you're going to want to hear over and over again. So as always, thank you for listening to the Leaders Coaching Leaders podcast. Michael, it is always good to see you.
Always good to see you, Peter. And as Zaretta would say, stay intellectually curious.